Welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. I've been traveling these past few weeks and have not been able to post any real videos, but I'm starting to get back to that now, and I'm revisiting some of the locations that I traveled to over the summer. One of those is Verona, which is in Italy on Lake Como, and it's a beautiful village. It has a lot of ups and downs, but brightly colored buildings and beautiful shadows. That's going to be our subject for today, is painting the shadows. And I'm also using this series to talk about some of the problems, typical problems that we have in working out of doors. And particularly today with the strong sunlight, our desire to paint shadows is there, but they're constantly changing. This is a big challenge for the watercolorist or any painter, is to capture shadows in a manner that's consistent and that gives a feeling of the light that we're seeing on our subject. So that'll be the root of what I talk about today. Here you can see the black and white study I've done to prepare myself to paint the subject, and you'll notice that I've been pretty consistent with the angles of my shadows. And this is one of the things that we set out to record when we're sketching. You can also take a photograph to help you remember the angles of the shadows that you observed at a certain moment, and use this later on to do a more finished painting. That's what I'm doing here. I'm using my sketch, which was done on location, as well as a photograph to give me some information about keeping my angles consistent as I'm painting the shadows. And I refer to those, if you look at the marks coming off of the balconies or off of the eaves of the buildings, I refer to those with a single line, because I know that I'm going to paint them in a more spontaneous fashion with some lively brushwork, but I use that line as sort of a guide and a memory of the angles of the shadows. And this you can record very quickly on location. So if it's one of the things that you're keen on painting, shadows on your subject, you should state that very early in the drawing so that as they move, you're not confused. You can constantly see the line to give you some guidance. Another problem in working on location with shadows as a main subject is nature can be deceptive, and that deception is carried forth in a photograph. And what I mean by that, I shouldn't say deception. It's when we look at nature and we see shadows close to us and shadows in the distance, often they appear to be the same value, when in truth if we compare them, they differ slightly. They tend to fade in the distance and grow a little weaker and a little cooler, whereas shadows that are closer to us are often bolder, and so on. And if you look at the reference photo in the beginning of the video, you can see that the photograph kind of ignores that. The camera is not as sensitive in picking that up, and the shadows are often portrayed in the same strength. To create depth in the painting, to create a believability in the painting, it's wise to reserve your stronger touches for the shadows that are close at hand. That'll help to create depth. Since our painting today is really built on shadows falling across multiple surfaces, different walls at different points in the picture, I'm going to be making an effort to show that in the strength of color that I use in the shadows. You might also refer to the black and white study that preceded all of this to get an idea of how we vary the strength of the color, the darkness of the color, to bring an object closer or to fade it off to the distance. In fact, I really recommend to all my students that they start their day with a black and white study or a single color study for a number of reasons. One is it gives you a warm-up. It allows you to start to paint your subject in a looser fashion where you're thinking only of lights and darks. You can easily move into thinking about brushwork and paint consistency and all these techniques that we use in watercolor much more readily. When we start to work with color, it's almost as if we're jugglers, and now we're juggling 5 balls instead of 2. The complication is increased, the decision making is doubled, and that interferes with the painting process. We're not as fluid, in other words. So I really recommend that instead of jumping right into your full painting, give yourself 45 minutes or so to do a single color study, a tonal study. You'll be glad you did, because it'll give you an understanding of your subject. It will allow you to encounter some of the problems that you may have with any particular motif, and allow you to develop some solutions on how to paint those. So I'm moving forward from my tonal study and starting to work with colors now. What I learned is, in doing the tonal study, is to use a lot of dry brush, very pale color, to create the frontal surfaces of the buildings. Very happy to leave broken passages, as this tended to reflect a feeling of glare or bright light in the buildings. I'm also going a little darker as I move from right to left in each single wash, whether it's the blue building, the yellow building, or the distant building, trying to get a little darker, a little transition in this first light wash. All the washes, these initial washes that I'm placing, are rather warm in nature, even including the blue has a bit of warmth to it. And this is to enhance the feeling of sunlight or sunshine falling on the subject. Warm colors do this best, and we'll counter that with cooler hues, darker hues that are cooler in the shadows. As we're developing the image, I'm constantly aware of the next step. The next step is going to be placing the shadows. And so this is led me to keep these initial washes very light, even lighter than they might appear in nature or that they might appear in the photograph, because I want the contrast to be a little stronger. I want the physical sensation to be a little stronger resulting from these shadows. And so I'm purposefully keeping a little more white on the paper and purposely keeping these initial washes lighter. So throughout this painting, I'm going to be pointing out changes that I made to the motif that I saw in front of me. One of the things I'm also going to be talking about is how I decide on a motif, what prompts me to stop and do a painting. I think this, for the beginner, this is sometimes a mysterious process that the artist goes through. What makes one subject more interesting than another? In the case of today's work, definitely the shadow pattern attracted me, and besides that, the foundation that's below all the shadows, there's sort of the shadow moves from the left along the ground and up the buildings in sort of a Z-like pattern. You'll see this as the composition develops, or if you want to return to the initial image or black and white study, even better to look at, as you can see how a Z moves from the bottom shadow up the wall and to the eaves of the buildings. This sort of pathway, or lazy S or Z in this case, is a great compositional tool to help you bring strength to your painting. In addition to that, you could also find a sort of U-based composition going from the left column across the ground and up the right column. This is another way to frame an area of interest in our paintings, and these are things that attract me to or suggest that this might be a good motif. Looking for a composition that is going to translate well, that's going to make the painting a little easier to compose, and also render some foundational strength to the image. So I'll be talking more about that in the series as it develops, but in particular in this painting, the pattern of shadows seem to form a beautiful composition, and I play on that throughout the placing of shadows. One thing that another detail that the camera seems to ignore, our eyes see it, especially when we're looking for it, is the transitions that happen inside any single shadow. That transition is really important to creating a beautiful effect. And what happens is where the shadow begins, there's a darkness or a concentration of color. It could be right under the balcony or right under the eave, and then as the shadow moves outward, it becomes paler, lighter, revealing more of the color that's underneath. This sort of graded wash, we accomplished this with the graded wash, is really useful in creating a feeling of luminosity or light bouncing back up into the subject. So as I'm placing the shadows, while they're wet, I return and add a bit of stronger color under the balcony or under the eaves, or where the tree is casting a shadow along the ground. I go a little darker towards the end of that shadow. You can see on the building to the left, that column, it's going from a little darker to a little lighter. Same in the shadows in the distance. Well, here's where the fun begins. Look, we get to do some expressive brushwork in creating our shadows. I'm trying to be as jubilant, as fun, and as accurate as possible. So I'm maintaining the angle, but I'm literally splashing paint onto the wall and dragging the brush to create some dry brush effects, using a bit more blue in this shadow, also a bit darker than the shadows that preceded it. Joining these shadows, this is a dark midtone and really serves as the large midtone of our painting. I'm making a conscious effort to join these shadows as I paint them and not leave them separated or disconnected. So you can see the shadow pattern is coming to life, and it's really helping to frame the two bright walls that we have of the buildings that we have, and continue to build on this idea, returning to the shadow now and then to add a little darker touch up under the eaves or up under the balcony. This is to make the shadow feel more luminous, brighter, as though light is almost emanating from the building and coming through the shadows. While we were traveling, we had most days was good weather, so we are seeing shadow play on most of the subjects that we encountered. In particular, though, this village of Varenna, which is on Lake Como, we just seemed to hit it at the right time, and the light was striking I guess partly because we're surrounded by water, there's more reflectivity or more light being cast into the city itself. You can see that I continue to think about brushwork and avoid too much fiddling around. I try to state a rail with one stroke, or a group of flowers with a little flourish, or a window with one stroke, or a broad pass with one stroke. This sort of calligraphic effect has a strong impression with the people looking at the painting, enjoying the painting. In fact, I'm one who believes that even if you don't know exactly what you're doing, pretend like you do, because this tends to read well, or tends to resound with your audience. If you're timid and trying to make a perfect shape, polishing the edges all the time, the shape loses its power, and that is equally affecting your audience. They tend to not understand or not find any interest in these shapes. But where you can be calligraphic and bold and strong, especially in a scene that has high contrast, as we see today, the resulting painting will have that same strong feeling, strong promotion. Well, the shadows are nearly in place. We've completed the passage on the wall. We've completed the passage on the ground. We've completed the passages under the balconies and the eaves, connected them. You can see that Z formed by these shadows, can't you? It goes from the left to right along the bottom, up the side of the wall, and then from left to right again out of the painting. And the eye follows this. This is a great way to lead the eye. Aside from being a representation of what we're seeing, it also communicates or helps to lead the viewer's eye through the painting and give you a sensation like you're able to take in more of the painting. Your eye is not really stopped or isolated at any one point. So here, what I'm doing now with, again, an attention to brushwork is creating a passage of foliage overhead, a reason for the shadows. In other words, these shadows are coming from somewhere. We want a sense of the tree. If you look at the reference photo, there is a tree, and the tree is much more in towards the center of the painting. I didn't like this tree too much. It was too well groomed and too simple looking. It looked like a lollipop. It was a beautiful tree, and it was certainly created as a tree for shade. The residents of Verona shaped this tree. They even put benches underneath it so you could sit in the shade. So it's all done in part for beauty, in part for comfort, but I felt it wouldn't complement my painting. So I'm giving a reference to this tree by just showing the overhead canopy. And with this canopy, you feel a connection to the foliage that's casting these marvelous shadows on the blue building. Now we start to make the shadows feel transparent. As they are right now, they're beautiful marks and descriptive marks, but they don't have the transparency of a shadow. In part, we created luminosity by adding some stronger darks within the shadows and making sure that they were graded. Now, with the addition of some dry brushwork to create a feeling of windows that pass through shadows, or doorways that pass through shadows, we start to create a transparency, the feeling of a transparent shadow. So this painting has dried at this point. The shadows have dried, and I'm using a smaller brush and dry brush to create windows, shutters, additional decorations to the building itself with dry brush. And as these windows or doorways pass through the shadows, the shadows themselves become more transparent. So all this information about rendering shadows, whether it's the angle, which changes throughout the day, the intensity, which varies from near to far, the color, which changes in a graded wash, the graded wash itself in a shadow, which creates luminosity, the use of bold, strong brushwork to paint your shadows, and at the same time describe the surface that they rest on. So you can see the angles coming off of the balconies tend to describe the surface of the building, as well as the splashed brush strokes. They tend to ride up the building and describe the surface, the shadow on the ground, a long shadow cast by the tree that we don't see. It's off the page, but we see the canopy, is also describing the angle of the ground. So all these little pieces of information, I believe, are going to help you to recognize the beauty of shadows and how they can be an important part of your building. They're going to help you to paint the shadows with some confidence and some authority. And they're going to help you to describe this luminosity, the bright light that we see. Without some strength in the shadows, the light will always feel rather pale and diffuse. If you want the overhead light to feel strong as it does today, you really have to go dark. And what that means is the paint consistency. It's all about paint consistency, isn't it? With watercolor, we tend to, the beginning painters tend to dilute their colors a little too much, or they work with color that's dried in the palette and is very hard to reconstitute, and as a result, colors that should be darker, such as these shadows, often turn out drying much weaker. This is because the color's too diluted. So we need some thicker paint to really render shadows in a meaningful way, as we're doing today. Well, look at how the shadow is starting to feel transparent now that I've introduced some doorways and windows passing through the shadows. We start to get the shadows start to cling to the building a little more, and that blue color is coming through, or that golden hue that's so descriptive of the buildings in Verona is coming through a little more. And we save this part, the addition of the doorways or windows or details on the architecture. We save this until the shadows dried completely, so that we can have a good amount of control and so that we can see the effect right away that placing shadows or objects through the shadows helps to make it feel more transparent. I have some other videos on my YouTube site that also deal with shadows, and in the description that follows, I really recommend you read the description. You can find additional information about materials that I use, about the message in the video. Sometimes there's a PDF that accompanies a video, and other important information. So after looking at the video, I recommend that you take a time to look at the description. It was a really wonderful trip for me I met about 30 artists in this trip, and in painting together for 6 days in Bellagio, Lake Como area. We formed a real strong bond. We are going out every day, painting for 6 to 7 hours. Sometimes that would extend into the evening. We did some nocturnes. It just created a wonderful bond between us as people, first as artists and then as people who enjoyed painting this lovely region, sharing a meal, sharing a drink at the end of the day. It was a great way for anyone to experience travel. You can see now I put some pavers into the shadow below and how it starts to make the surface a little more distinct. You can also see that the shadow becomes more transparent when we do that. So all of this is to kind of drive home the fact that there's a lot of energy that we can create with shadows. And as outdoor painters, when we're working on location, almost every painting is going to include shadows to one degree or another, even still life, even portraiture. So it's helpful to start to think of these and ways that you can improve on painting your shadows with watercolor. Well, the painting is nearly finished. Let's have a look at the finished piece. And you can see I've added some figures. I've made some adjustments to the back of the painting by softening some of those distant shadows so that I get a little more depth in the painting. Well, how about the light? The light is quite luminous. I'm pleased by that quality in the painting and the drama or the flare that's achieved with the cast shadows on the wall. And so this is the first of a series. I'm going to be addressing primarily problems and solutions that we encounter when working out of doors. And all of these paintings will be coming out of a recent trip to Bellagio and Venice. So stay tuned and take time to read the description. It'll answer some of the questions you have about materials and about other aspects of this video. Thank you.